Please join me in warmly welcoming to Google Brendan Nyhan and D.J. Flynn.
Well, thank you, Laura, for organizing this, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's super exciting to be here and to talk with you all about misinformation today. So our plan is I'm going to talk first, that's the top half of the slide here, about the political system today and why different aspects of American politics today are conducive to creating misperceptions that influence people's attitudes and behaviors and often persist for a long period despite the provision of accurate information. So I'm going to talk about that first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brendan, who's going to talk about a little bit more specifically about the role of fake news and fake news in 2016 in particular. This is a roadmap of my part of the talk today. I'm going to begin by talking about some contextual elements in American politics that are conducive to misinformation, as I mentioned. I'll then give some examples to give you a sense of the extent of partisan differences in factual beliefs about politics. I'll talk about some institutional responses that we've seen to misinformation, mostly in the United States, and then I'll outline some challenges and opportunities moving forward. So to begin with the contextual discussion, I think any discussion of American politics today has to start by acknowledging the huge and really historic levels of partisan polarization that we see at the elite level in the United States. So this is a plot showing roll call ideology scores in Congress for members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party over time. So higher scores here are more liberal voting records in Congress, and lower scores on the y-axis are more conservative records. And as you can see by this increasing divergence over time, we have a dramatic polarization in ideology among political elites. That is to say, Democrats are becoming more and more liberal in their roll call voting, Republicans becoming more and more conservative, and there's just less area of ideological agreement at the elite level, which, as we'll see, has important implications for how partisans in the mass public, how ordinary Democrats and Republicans form opinions and factual beliefs about politics. Another really important institutional change that we've seen in recent decades is the resurgence of partisan media. So we now see explicitly ideological and sometimes partisan outlets providing information. This is important for a huge number of reasons, but I'll focus just on one that's relevant for the discussion today. And that is that when you have a highly partisan, highly fragmented media system, what you have is you have people watching certain channels and coming away, watching different types of channels and coming away with fundamentally different understandings of the same issue or event. Okay, so if we think about events that are in the news today and how the same event is covered by Sean Hannity on Fox, for example, and Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, they might be covering the same sort of larger story, like the potential link between the Trump campaign and Russia, but they cover it from very, very different angles. And so partisan viewers of each network come away with very different factual understandings of the same issue. This is a relatively new aspect of the media system, right? So up until recent decades, we had a relatively homogeneous media system with a small number of channels, right? Not as much partisan choice. And that's important because it led to the opposite of what we have today, right? People had a smaller selection of news channels to watch, and they came away with the same basic set of facts, which we increasingly no longer have. Now, one important result of this resurgence in partisan media and increase in partisanship in the mass public is a large increase in what we political scientists call affective polarization. So affect, right, it's just simply how you feel about a certain group, usually an outgroup. So there are lots of different ways of measuring affective polarization in politics. This is one of the more clever ones on the top here. This shows the trend in the percent of people who would be upset if a member of their immediate family married a member of the other political party. There are lots of measures of affective polarization, but this is one of the more interesting ones, I think. And you see the pretty steady linear increase over the time series on the x-axis, and this huge spike around 2008, 2009.
Don't you have just 3 data points?
I'm sorry?
It looks like just 3 data points. 1960 and 2008.
The line might be smooth. I'm not sure. These aren't my data. Yeah, I think there's a lowest smoother on the line. Another sort of more straightforward more straightforward measure of this, right, is just how do you feel sort of 0 to 100? Do you feel cool toward the opposing party or warm toward the opposing party? And we see pretty steady decreases among people across the partisan spectrum in terms of how they feel about members of the opposing party. And that negative trend is especially dramatic, right, among strong Democrats and strong Republicans. Now that's important, right, because people who tend to be strongly partisan participate more, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to contact members of Congress, and so those highly politically active, influential people are more and more affectively polarized towards members of the other party. Okay, and these are some of the contextual changes in the U.S. political system in recent years that have led to really dramatic partisan differences in factual beliefs. Okay, so I'm showing some examples here that I think many of us will recognize, but I think the data really help us understand how much factual polarization we've seen on these issues over time, which is that time trend often gets lost, right, in media coverage. And so we see partisan differences in factual beliefs about major social and economic problems, like beliefs about the cause of global warming, and lots of other really hugely influential policy issues. So this is just showing, right, the percent of people who believe that the rise in the Earth's temperature is due mostly to human activity among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And you see this increasing divergence over time. Right? Okay. We also see these partisan differences in factual beliefs on the content of major legislation, right, like the Affordable Care Act or tax reform that's being debated now, or ACA repeal that's being debated now. So this is a really cool graph from a paper that Brendan wrote in 2010, which I often steal for talks like this. So this shows the percent of people who believe in the left panel that the Clinton healthcare reform proposal in the early 1990s would result in people losing their choice of doctor. And it shows belief in that claim by different partisan groups, right? Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, independents in green. And what's even more interesting here, and maybe a little bit depressing, right, is you'll notice there are two points for each party, corresponding down here on the x-axis to people who report that they have it's too early or they don't know very much about the plan, versus partisans who say they have a really good understanding of the plan. So these are people who self-report that they know a lot about the plan. And we see that the more people think they know, the more misinformed they actually are in some cases, right? So we see huge partisan disagreement among partisans who claim to have a really good factual understanding of these issues. And we see a similar pattern about the death panel claim in the Affordable Care Act in 2009 on the right side. Okay. This is perhaps the most famous example, right, of partisan differences in factual beliefs in recent years. This shows, right, differences in the belief that Barack Obama was or was not born in the United States. Not surprisingly, right, huge differences here. Okay. Now, so we have this partisan disagreement on all these different facts that play a large role in policy debates. And we've seen a lot of institutional responses to this and attempts to correct misperceptions and bring partisans together in sort of their factual understanding of politics. The first one that I think is really important, right, is the rise of political fact-checking. So there's this nice new report out by the Duke Reporters Lab that tracks the trend in the growth of fact-checking over the past 10 or so years. And we've seen about 150% explosion in fact-checkers across the globe in the last 3 years in response to this upsurge in misinformation in democracies across the world. Okay. Right. A related point, right? We've seen an uptick in watchdog journalism. So even as a lot of newspapers, right, face financial burdens and they're shrinking their news teams, we've seen a lot of papers sort of recalibrate their focus and focus a lot more on investigative watchdog-style journalism. So these are some headlines from very recent months, right, about fact-checking claims made by Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Played a large role in the campaign and still play a large role today. Okay. Now, of course, there are still a lot of challenges ahead for fact-checkers and other people who seek to mitigate misinformation in politics. The first is declining trust in media over time, right? So people self-reported trust in media has declined pretty steadily in recent decades. It doesn't help when you have prominent members of both parties, frankly, who regularly make arguments that media can't be trusted and can't be trusted to adjudicate these factual disputes that we see. Okay. There's also this echo chamber problem, which Brendan's going to talk about in a moment. And this is the idea that given that explosion in media choice that I talked about in the beginning, people sometimes expose themselves to information selectively. That is to say, Democrats, for instance, might watch MSNBC or read the Huffington Post. Republicans might watch Fox or read Breitbart. There's a lot of new research with really cool data that you're going to hear about in a second, tracking the extent of this and who actually engages in this. But this is a challenge to be sure. Another sort of disclaimer that I just want to give before I conclude is that a lot of the examples that I've focused on in the talk are highly partisan facts, right, by definition, that are at the center of partisan disagreement. And you might say, oh, well, you're always going to see partisan disagreement on these sorts of issues. Perhaps that's not super troubling. But I want to highlight that we see a lot of misperceptions, factual misperceptions, that are widely held by members of both parties. Okay, and these exist on really important issues like foreign aid. This is one example. People tend to vastly overestimate the size of outgroups like immigrants and minority groups in general. There are huge misperceptions about tax policy, which is being debated right now, right, about the percent of the budget that goes to various things like foreign aid, defense, and that sort of thing. So it's not just that we see partisan disagreement on these highly charged issues, right? We see them broadly across lots of different issues that are coming up. Now, there are, of course, opportunities to address some of this. So that I'll just highlight two in closing here. So the first potentially useful strategy for practitioners, right, who are interested in combating misinformation, right, is to call people out, which is largely what fact checkers do, and try to increase the reputational costs of false statements. So if politicians feel that they have to pay a price when they make inaccurate statements, we can try to attack the sort of supply side of misinformation rather than focusing on what happens sort of post false statement and correcting people's misperceptions after they hold them. This is sort of the fact-checking model, but I want to emphasize that, of course, you don't have to be a sort of institutionalized fact-checking organization to do this. Tools at places like Google and Facebook and elsewhere have made efforts at flagging false claims at the point of communication. Try this same strategy, right? And the second opportunity I want to highlight is there are a lot of really highly credible sources that can combat misperceptions even when they're highly polarized along political lines. One situation in which misperceptions are often a little bit easier to correct is when you can get a partisan or ideological actor speaking against his or her own self-interest. That's often highly persuasive, right? There are lots of experiments, for instance, that show that if you can get a Republican to combat the claim that there were death panels in the Affordable Care Act, that's a much more persuasive cue than if you can get somebody who is just totally in support of the Affordable Care Act, for instance, to do that. And there are lots of other examples. And finally, unexpected sources are often really highly persuasive in correcting misperceptions. So there's a neat new paper that shows that when corrective information about the human causes of global warming is provided by military organizations or defense-related entities as opposed to scientists, it's just a more surprising source, and it sort of disarms people and has a much more powerful impact. So these are just two opportunities that I wanted to flag that have sort of come up in recent research. There are certainly others, but with that, I'll turn it over to Brendan.
All right. So what I want to do now is turn more specifically to the 2016 election. That what DJ's done hopefully is given you an overview of why we might be especially concerned about people's vulnerability to misperceptions in the partisan age that we live in this country. So I'm going to talk specifically about the 2016 election, focusing on fake news, but you should, of course, think of that, and I'm going to say what I mean by fake news in a moment, but you should think of that as a subset of the larger problem of misinformation that DJ's been talking about. Fake news is one particular manifestation of the ways in which people's political commitments can influence what they choose to believe is true and the information they consume. But it's hardly the only one. And in some ways, its importance may be overstated, as I'll talk about. The concern that a lot of people have have expressed since the election is whether people are not just living in echo chambers of opinion, but echo chambers of fact. Right? In other words, it's not just that we tend to interact both online and off with people who share our political commitments, but that we may actually be only hearing from or disproportionately hearing from people who share our same understanding of the world. Right? And that's not just from your social counterparts, but from the information you consume. Right? And that's very worrisome to people. Right? Even if we disagree about opinions, about what we should do, you'd like to think that we could have a debate as a democracy based on some shared set of facts. And the fear that's come out of this election, of course, is that that's no longer the case. So I want to talk about fake news in the 2016 election in the context of that question and help you try to give you some intuition on how you might think about that problem. Okay, so this is my technical analysis of the state of factual discourse in the 2016 election, right? If it seemed terrible to you, it was terrible. We study this full time, and we agree. I mean, there's no systematic way to say how factual a political debate was over time, historically. There's no agreed upon set of standards. But I think it's fair to say a qualitative judgment is that this election was especially poor. Okay? The reason for that starts with the unprecedented level of elite misinformation that came out during this campaign. There's no way around that fact. Okay? And that, both candidates obviously said many things that were false or unsupported. One of them said it with historic frequency, and it was unprecedented his unwillingness to retract or correct the record when a misstatement was made. Okay? We'll set that aside. The question of interest for us today, though, in the second part of the talk, is what happened with fake news. So here are 5 of the most widely shared fake news stories of the 2016 campaign, according to sharing data from Facebook compiled by Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed. Okay? And you can see that they're often quite outlandish and over the top. Right? So Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is disqualified from office. Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. And the FBI agent involved in the email investigation is dead in a murder-suicide. Okay? But there are many, many more cases like this. There's a whole industry of fake news that sprung up during the campaign. Okay? To give you a sense of the magnitude of this, Silverman found that the most shared fake news stories, according to the public Facebook sharing data. Of course, the Facebook data science team knows more about this than I do, but I can tell you from the public sharing data that he found the most shared fake news stories were shared more often than the most shared mainstream news stories in that period before the election. Now, that doesn't mean that the audience for fake news was greater, okay? Because there were a few viral hits and a lot of duds in the fake news, in the set of fake news articles that were published, right? So it's still the case that the mainstream media was far more widely shared during that period. But it does suggest how quickly these kinds of stories can reach a very large audience, right? So if you imagine this many million shares happening on Facebook and how many times people are at least passing by the headline, if not necessarily reading the article, these seem to have been very widespread, right? And many of you probably saw these at some point during the election campaign. Okay. Now, it's hard to say exactly how many. Again, the Facebook data science team knows, I don't, but we can try to answer this question in some different ways. So Silverman and his colleague at BuzzFeed went back and asked people, did you remember seeing or hearing about this story in the last few weeks? And they find somewhere between approximately 10 and 20% of Americans said they did. This is a survey fielded very soon after the election. Now, the problem with this, as you're probably thinking, is, of course, it's hard to remember every news story I saw. And that's true. Okay? So what we'd really like to have is who clicked through and who read this using behavioral data rather than a self-reported recall measure like this. Right? Some of these people may be falsely believing they saw a story and they never actually saw it, and vice versa. Okay? But it gives you a sense of the approximate magnitude. And what they did find was among those folks who said they had seen or heard about these stories, that somewhere around 2/3 to 4/5 believe that these stories were accurate. Okay? So it seems like there was a non-trivial number of Americans who encountered these stories, remembered them, and believed them. Okay? There's similar data here from 2 economists, Alcott and Genskow. It's a little bit small on the slide. The grouping of interest is in the middle portion of the y-axis, the false stories, where they asked people again, do you think this was true? And they showed them a bunch of false headlines, as well as some true ones and some placebo headlines they made up. And what you can see is, again, around 10 to 20% of Americans for any given fake news headline said they believed it was true. A very large number, though, said they didn't know or they weren't sure, right? Often 50% of the public or more, which is troubling if you look at what the content of these sorts of fake news headlines was. For example, the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton is involved in a pedophilia ring being run out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., right? So somewhere around, if you look at the line there, that 40 to 50% of Americans are saying either that's true or they're not sure, right? So we'd really like the answer to be no, right? That it's false, okay? So these things can, again, even for those people who don't believe them, they raise questions and doubts, potentially, that may be worrisome, right? People may be vulnerable to at least calling into question things that we wouldn't like to be called into question because they are, in fact, false. So why did this happen? Okay, so I want to just identify two factors you might think about. And this is obviously relevant to how people interact with Google in its various forms, right? Why we're vulnerable to this, right? The first is the choice of the information we consume, which is often called selective exposure. That in some contexts, in some circumstances, we pick and choose the information we consume according to the extent to which it's consistent with our political preferences. Okay? That's going to vary depending on the context you're in and the motivation you have to seek out that sort of information. As I'll show you, and as DJ suggested, it's not universal. But it's very much a threat, especially in the context of something like a campaign when people's political emotions are at a fever pitch, right? That was as passionate about politics as people get, and that was a time when people might be especially interested in something that seemed to confirm how they felt about a candidate or to disconfirm something they'd like to hear disconfirmed. The second problem is what's called directionally motivated reasoning. So all of those factors that are causing people to feel so strongly about politics and become so polarized mean that when we encounter that information, our directional preferences about what's true often override our motivation to hold an accurate belief, right? The side we'd like to be correct, right? We often conclude they have the stronger argument. They have the more persuasive claim, okay? Even when that's not the case. So this raises a real challenge for fact checkers or for information providers of any sort, including everyone here, right? So the first question you might think about in terms of fact checking as a potential response to fake news and misinformation more generally is, in terms of selective exposure, do people read them, right? And it's not just, so the fact checkers will tell you, and I should say I know the fact checkers and they're great and they work very hard, okay? And they do have very large audiences now compared to where they were not very long ago. But what you might think about is, are the right people reading fact checks? And are they reading fact checks of the right claims, right? It may be the case that the people reading fact checks are not necessarily the ones who are holding the given misperception in question, right? And it might even be the case that you read fact checks, but you read the fact check of the claim by the other side that you don't want to be true, right? So it's not good enough to say, well, fact checks are out there and some people are reading them. You really want to think about targeting. Is the person whose mind you think could be changed by the fact check being reached by that fact check, okay? The problem with fact checking, and I'm sure those of you who've worked with surfacing fact checks in Google have thought about this problem, is that everyone thinks everyone else needs them, right? We don't think we need them ourselves. We think, well, I'm well informed, but those other people, they really should read the fact checks more, right? And that's been an obstacle to all sorts of technological solutions to this, right? This is something where the demand among the people we'd like to read the fact checks isn't often as strong as we'd like, okay? And even if they do happen to read the fact check or encounter it, will they find it persuasive? That's the next question, right? So even if we overcome selective exposure and they choose to consume that piece of information, is it persuasive to them? Do they evaluate that fact check and conclude, okay, this claim I thought was true is actually false? Right? And that's where we worry directionally motivated reasoning would get in the way. When you think about fake news in the 2016 election, though, I want to encourage you to go beyond the psychological factors we've been talking about and think about the supply side, as DJ alluded to, not just the demand side. Okay? Human psychology isn't going to change. Right? Political scientists can tell you polarization is not going away. Okay? So for both of those reasons, trying to change the extent to which people engage in selective exposure and directionally motivated reasoning is going to be very difficult. Okay? There may be ways to mitigate it on the margin, and DJ gave you some suggestions of how we might do that. But we also have to think about the supply side. Okay? there's a reason that people entered this market. Right? There were entrepreneurs who were attracted to this market. You've all read, I assume, about the Macedonian teenagers who across the ocean said, I can buy a new guitar if I write fake news stories for American audiences and sell ads against them. Right? So the financial incentives played a really big role here. The partisanship that people had made it financially attractive to create content that would attract audiences you could sell ads against. Right? So the ad networks are playing an important role here. Okay? The second factor that's really important is distribution mechanisms, right? And Facebook seems to have played, as I'll show you some more direct evidence for this in a moment, but Facebook in particular seems to have played a key role in distributing fake news, okay? The reporting we have about the publishers of fake news is that they would go seed those articles into pro-Trump Facebook groups as a distribution mechanism. And people in those groups would then push them out. And that was part of how they would get these stories to wide distribution. Okay. So those sorts of platforms are, potentially enabling the spread of bad information, not just good. Okay. And the final factor, of course, is that negative partisanship, as DJ emphasized to you, is so powerful now. It's not just polarization, it's not just partisanship, it's how much people don't like the other side. Right? And that's creating a demand for information about why the other side is bad, why the other side is evil, why the other side, and obviously that's terribly destructive to the kinds of compromise and living together that we need for a democracy to work. Okay, so this is a deep and fundamental problem, but this is one expression of it that's especially pernicious, because now we're not only potentially intensifying that negative partisanship, but we're misleading people about the facts as well. Okay, but not, I suggested to you earlier, and I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of this, that not everyone is engaging in this all the time, right? So you're probably saying, well, I don't go seek out fake news that conforms to my political viewpoints at all times, and that's probably true. Okay, so this is data from my co-author Andy Guess at NYU, looking at a near representative sample of Americans who've provided consent for sharing their online web traffic data. Okay, and there's two plots here. I'm going to talk you through the differences between them. What he's doing is he's looking at the estimated slant of the media outlets they visit in terms of websites. Okay? And the slant estimate comes from the average ideology of the people who share these sites on Facebook. Okay? So it's from an article by some Facebook data scientists. So what you can see in the left panel is that the average person's average media outlet is quite centrist regardless of party. Okay? So the average person is not seeking out a steady diet of skewed partisan information. Most people don't care about politics that much, especially outside of a campaign context. This is 2015 data. Okay? But what you can see in the right panel is that the distribution at the audience level, in terms of where the overall set of traffic is going by party, looks very different. Right? That's where you're seeing that big partisan polarization between the kinds of sites Democrats go to in the left in blue and the kind of sites that Republicans go to on the right. And there's a smaller set of folks on both sides of the aisle who are consuming large amounts of information disproportionately from like-minded media outlets. Okay?
Could you read the labels on the news sources?
I'm sure. Yes. From left to right, Daily Kos, the Huffington Post, and the New York Times. CNN just to the left of the red spike. MSN is on the middle. There's still a remarkable number of people who go to the main portals like MSN and Yahoo. And then on the right, Fox News and Breitbart. So, I mentioned this to you earlier about the role of Facebook. Here's some partial evidence that's consistent with that. I might or might not have more information about this that I could talk to you in a non-recorded format. What these economists, Alcott and Gensko, found is that fake news sites were differentially likely to have been reached via social media. Okay, so you can see in the bottom bar here, more than 40% of their visits originated in social media compared to only about 10% for top news sites. Okay? So it seems to have been a really important traffic driver. Search, a smaller traffic driver relative to top news, but a non-trivial one, right? About 22% there. So in terms of fact-checking and its role in countering fake news, one of the problems was that no one really expected this. And so the fact-checkers weren't on top of it as a target for fact-checking. They typically have focused on elite statements made by politicians, party members, right, the president, members of Congress, people like that. And The only exception, for the most part, was Snopes, which focuses more on rumors and hoaxes, which fake news seemed to fall more squarely within. But even still, I would say that everyone was caught off guard by this. Okay, so now there's going to be more fact-checking of fake news. I think it's fair to say. And the question is, how effective will it be? And I just want to, just raise some questions that you should think about as you think about how effective these kinds of approaches might be. Okay. The first one, as I mentioned to you earlier, is that the people who read fake news may or may not actually see a fact check of it. Right? It's entirely possible to have a world where those are two disjoint sets, okay? Or ones with very little overlap. Okay? And so we should worry a lot about the extent to which the fact checking of fake news that's being done right now is reaching the people we'd like it to reach. The second point is I would just encourage you to be very specific about what you mean by the effects of fake news. This is something that people talk about very loosely. And I think it's often, fake news is being used as this kind of catch-all term for all sorts of misinformation, and people are making sweeping claims about its effects that I don't think are well supported by the facts. So in the case of fake news, you'll hear people say fake news affected the outcome of the election. I don't think there's any evidence for that in terms of changing who won. Okay? It's very difficult to show that. You'd have to make very strong assumptions. That Alcott and Genskow article I mentioned walks you through the kinds of assumptions you'd have to make to get to an outcome like that. Similarly, fact-checking itself may not change that many votes. Right? Even if you've read a fact check, think of your own life. If you've read a fact check that changed your mind about something, did it change how you were going to vote or which party you preferred? Probably not. Right? So we have to be realistic about what fact checking can and can't accomplish. Right? And then finally, I would just encourage you to think about misinformation in general and not focus on fake news to the exclusion of this larger problem, which is a much more systematic one than these particular sites that have popped up that are wholly fake, non-journalistic. Right, the Macedonian teenager version of fake news. All right, so I want to conclude with a brief discussion to get us moving towards the Q&A and your thoughts about what to do about this in terms of the policy responses that are being pursued out there and what might be effective. Okay? So the first thing is to think about ad networks. No one has any constitutional right to be part of an ad network. Right? In fact, as a company, you should wish to protect your brand from any association with these terrible, misleading sites. Okay? So it seems as though ad networks are starting to crack down on who is allowed to be a member of them, and they're starting to even be whitelisting policies put into place. Right? So then rather than stripping out the worst sites, they're selectively adding the best. Okay? So I think that's a promising approach. That's also going to be driven by the advertisers who are increasingly worried about what their ad is showing, what content their ad is showing up against. Obviously, YouTube is dealing with this on a massive scale right now. Second, thinking about the algorithm. I know there's probably like 10 search people here who don't want to hear my thoughts on the algorithm, but let me just say there was an announcement made that fake news was being downweighted in the algorithm, and I think that's appropriate given the concerns about the quality of this kind of information. Right? You are not serving your users well if you are surfacing that information up. It is not high quality. Right? And then finally, the most developed response we've seen has been the fact-checking partnership with the fact-checkers partnership with Facebook, where they're going to identify stories that have been rated as false by established fact-checkers. They're going to give you a nudge first when you see it, and again if you'd like to share it, saying this, just so this is disputed by this fact-checker and that fact-checker. Okay? And that's a more deliberate kind of intervention that provides information to people, but in it, I think, an appropriately hands-off way that keeps Facebook out of the business of trying to adjudicate what's true and false. Okay? It leaves that to the journalists where that's their core competency. Okay? So one last point is just simply to say this is an evolving problem. Okay? So if you've followed the political debate since the election, the kinds of misinformation you see out there looks quite different. The form it's taking is different. Okay? There are all these conspiracy-minded folks on Twitter writing and circulating fairly crazy things. I won't get into too much of it, but let me just say that there's just an article about a Harvard University professor, very famous law professor, as well as a senator who are citing the most non-credible conspiracy sites on the left to make sweeping, unsupported claims about Trump and Russia. So this misinformation problem is evolving and changing, and you should be aware of how rapidly it evolves and avoid the mistake of fighting the last war. Okay? So with that note, we would love your questions, and I just want to say, please don't give up, right? Remember we may not be able to put out the dumpster fire, but we can at least bring it down a little, okay? And it's important not to give in to this temptation to say we're in a post-truth and post-fact society, and there's nothing we can do about it. There is something we can do about it. We should defend these norms, and you at the platforms, like Google and Facebook, can in some ways do more than almost anybody. So I think we'd love your questions, and thanks very much.
Hi. So I came to this talk. Part of the reason I came was because I was a little bit worried about my own personal bubble that I might be in and how would I know about this. And I'm a liberal, and I noticed that most of the fake news stories that you gave were aimed towards Republicans. So I wanted to know, is it the case that most fake news stories were aimed at Republicans, or can you give some examples of fake news stories that were aimed at Democrats?
So during the election, the fake news was overwhelmingly pro-Trump. There were only a handful of pro-Clinton fake news stories that took off. Some people tried it. It wasn't as successful in the marketplace. So at least in that particular format, it seemed to have not worked. But as I was suggesting to you, some of these dubious conspiracy sites have gotten more traction among Democrats in the time since the election, when Trump is in office and he's the kind of scary opponent who motivates belief in misinformation the way Clinton was during the campaign. Yeah.
I would totally concur, and I would just say that it's important to keep in mind. I think my mic's off. Sorry about that. It's important to keep in mind that misinformation exists within this larger political context, and the nature of party competition, and who's in the White House, and who's in control of Congress. These are all things that shift over time and are going to continue to shift over time, right? So if we think about the demand for misinformation about just the president, for example, who's the most salient political figure in the United States, of course, the partisan coalitions who are demanding that information is going to shift over time, and you're going to see the flow and the supply of fake news and misinformation more generally be responsive to those shifting conditions that I talked about.
I'm going to hand the mic over to John, who's picking up some questions from the dory.
Sure. So this is from the London office. Do you have anything particular to say about fake science, or is it all the same no matter what the subject?
So I've done research on vaccine misinformation, and that's certainly, DJ mentioned climate change. So this is certainly something that's not specific to politics. It extends to health and science as well. Right? And vaccines is a good example where it's not an ideological or partisan issue as such, and misinformation can still be quite widespread, and people can still engage in selective exposure and directionally motivated reasoning too. So I think there's reason to question in all of these domains where people have strong views and about an issue that seems to implicate some aspect of their identity. There's a real potential to have counterproductive effects, or for people to seek out information that seems to confirm their views. Right? So just to give you an example, there is a measles outbreak going on right now in Minnesota in the Somali American community predominantly. And the story that's been told by our journalists there is that some children had autism and the parents didn't know why. That wasn't a concept they were familiar with. And people started to search. And they found their way to some of the really terrible information out there, and have since been and as they became more interested in that, some folks invited the anti-vaccine activists who present this misleading and false science, and they've cultivated that community to the point that their vaccination rates dropped very low, and made them vulnerable to what is now an ongoing outbreak. And measles is a very dangerous disease, explosively contagious, right? So this is it's a good reminder that misinformation doesn't have to be partisan, and it can have very immediate and dangerous consequences.
I have a question about the sort of the psychology side of the recipients of the fake news. I know people who love to be know-it-alls, and they will happily fill in the gaps in their knowledge as they're explaining something. I wonder if any investigation has been done about whether they are particularly vulnerable to the misinformation, or because they are, it's like once they've accepted it, they're going to tout it enthusiastically. I'm inferring that they will do that. I suppose I should leave it to you.
So the closest sort of individual level factor that I can think about there that's been studied is there are psychological studies on the need for closure, or the need for certainty, and there's a lot of variation across people in their score on that, right? Like some people, to your point, need to know things and need to fill in the blanks. Now, to the extent that those those people are highly partisan, highly political people. Directionally motivated reasoning, right, would suggest that they're going to apply their abilities to forming partisan or ideologically consistent views, and I think that I could definitely see that happening. I'm not aware of any studies on sort of the effect of individual level differences like that on the propensity to have misperceptions or something. I don't know if you would add to that.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And I would just say that people, what you were saying about people kind of filling in the gaps, right? Another thing you might think about here is conspiracy theories often have that function, and kind of, which you can think of as a kind of subset of misinformation or misperceptions. Sorry, my microphone's off. You can think of conspiracy theories as a kind of subset of misinformation or misperceptions, where people who want to understand what's going on or think they understand what's going on are filling in gaps. Okay? So we don't know why, we don't really understand why autism happens, right? The vaccine story provides a simple explanation, right? There's chaotic and conflicting information about what happened on 9/11. The inside job myth seems to explain what happened. And you go through the list, these misperceptions will often have that flavor of seeming to provide a compelling, simple explanation for what's going on. And some people, I think, do intuitively gravitate to those. There's definitely evidence that people who are predisposed to see the world in that way will disproportionately believe in conspiracy theories.
Here's another question. This one's from Mountain View. There have been some discussion that the issue of misinformation is exacerbated by readers not knowing how to critically read news and/or navigate the overwhelming nature of the current high-choice media environment. How might this concern be relevant to Google?
Ooh, that's a good one. Let me say a couple things. There's been a lot of interest since the election in news and media literacy, and I think educators are thinking about this as an issue. So one of the things Google might be able to do is support news and media literacy as a component of civics education, as something that librarians could teach. There's lots of ways in which we might help equip people to become better citizens, right? The educational approach, though, is pretty limited in the sense that you're only getting those younger folks as they come through the educational system year by year, right? But we have a very large set of adults who are not in the educational system anymore, and we might think about how we could reach them more effectively. I think this is an area where libraries are probably the most effective vehicle. We have all these institutions full of books, and librarians are trying to repurpose themselves as helping people navigate the world of information, right? We don't need them to help us find books anymore, but they want to be information navigators. So I think there might be opportunities for things like partnerships. At the same time, I think we have to think about how to make it easier for people in the first place, right? I worry there's too much, and I don't mean to attribute this to your questioner, but in general out in the world, there's too much kind of lecturing people for not being sophisticated. We need to help them make better decisions, right? In a responsible, ethical way, where we don't tell them we know the right answer and we're gonna, in a condescending way, give it to them, but that we create, a kind of information architecture that helps people make better decisions and get better information.
Yeah, and this is where the adjustments to search algorithms and different tools that you all can offer are extremely helpful because, right, we do have this proliferation of news sources, most of which are high quality and are credible. And so, to the extent that we're highlighting those and we're training people over time as they become more and more used to searching and as they increasingly rely on Google, right, for everything in their lives, the better they can get at distinguishing between high and low quality is going to be really important.
I had a quick question about the polarization data that you showed at the beginning, especially that climate change chart is very striking. And it's easy to read that as the same cohort of people changing their minds over time, but the set of adults voting Republicans was not the same in 2014. I myself shifted from one of those lines to another one of my lines, taking my climate change beliefs with me, partially because I felt more comfortable on the other line with my current set of climate change beliefs. And so do you have a feeling for how much of this is people changing minds and how much of this is minds shifting their identification?
That's a great question. I mean, so given the polarization of politics today, you see for most people, right, a strengthening of party attachment, and people are less likely to switch sides. So this is interesting. Yeah, I mean, so the question, whenever you see partisan changes like that, like the ones I showed, it always comes down to this question of, is it persuasion or replacement, right, or people forming new coalitions. in the case of climate change, I mean, climate change has just become so politicized in how it's communicated in media that it sort of is a political issue now. It's almost covered as a political issue in a sort of left versus right framework as opposed to a scientific framework that other issues are discussed in. So yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a lot of within party persuasion on that issue, right? My sense would be that it's mostly people moving to adjust their views with their party.
Right. So in general, the evidence suggests that people do go along with their party on these kinds of cues, right? I mean, if you think about it, right, you know, in the 70s and 80s, the idea that it was somehow partisan what you thought about the climate was preposterous. That wasn't on anyone's agenda whatsoever, right? But the set of elite cues that people were getting started to diverge, and then we saw this kind of tribalistic movement along those lines as people followed, right? There are those folks who might switch lines, as you suggest, but I'd say far more just, you know, to the extent that they've thought about climate change, they're taking cues from people they trust as to what they should believe.
If you think about how most people, right, form opinions on most issues, right? Most people on most issues are not very informed and not very interested, and so it's a really easy heuristic to use if people, right, if the media just presents an issue as a left versus right issue, it's a very easy cue for people to take as opposed to engaging in more effortful sort of info search about global warming, right? You just go to your team. Yeah.
Hi. My question's around you presented kind of some findings of how people are discovering fake news, whether it's from search or social media, but has there been any work that kind of understands how they make it into those environments, ranging, because I mean things get created and there must be some strategies or maybe common attributes that help these things get very wide distribution, because these things don't get widely distributed if they were just created. There must be some strategies that might, some patterns that are emerging, and I was wondering if you had thoughts or there's some research that's on this particular topic.
The mechanism we know best is the seeding of these fake news articles into Facebook groups. You know, as you guys know, but a lot of audiences don't, right? Facebook is orders of magnitude larger than Twitter. It's the most important traffic driver of news audiences online, bar none. And so it seems like that was where how people were getting from social media to the fake news sites, was the seeding happened, and that was starting a diffusion process. Now, again, it's important to think about this, like this is a very skewed distribution, right? There's a very large number of fake news articles that almost no one read. And if you go to these fake news sites, there's tons and tons of these. They were really mass produced in a very slipshod way. And, you know, in kind of monkeys on typewriters fashion, every so often they hit on a big one, right? And that one went hugely viral and seems to have disseminated often primarily via social media. But that's certainly not the only thing, as you can see here.
So I want to follow up on that one. You're being, I think, scrupulously neutral about, you know, the source of this stuff. You know, is it stuff's just out there in a Darwinian sense? You know, some of this seems to, you know, get viral and take off just because it resonates with people, or is there something more purposeful going on? Whether it's, you know, particular groups that have, you know, particular agendas, state actors, whatever. Do you study that?
So the state actor part is hard to assess. You know, you should ask the intelligence community. The reporting on fake news specifically right now suggests a more decentralized process where people were being attracted largely by the profit motive. In some cases, they might have ideological partisan motives as well, but there's very little evidence of a kind of coordinated effort, right? So I showed you that FBI agent story earlier, the Hillary Clinton investigation. He died in a murder suicide. The guy who wrote that was literally unemployed, living at home, trying to figure out how to make money. He's since come forward and explained his story. The Macedonian teenagers didn't seem to have any particular axe to grind as far as anyone can tell, and so forth. So it's possible there's coordination or state actors. Certainly there's other kinds of state-sponsored misinformation online we can talk about. But in terms of the set of sites that were being widely distributed during the campaign, I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of hard evidence of the record of that at this point.
So journalists are constantly thinking about how they can rewrite headlines or taglines to make their content, real news, we like to call it, go viral. Were there particular headline structures or pictures added or structures to specific Facebook posts that kind of stood out in a common thread for these posts that went viral?
I would say the common thread was mostly Hillary is evil, right? If you had to boil it down to 3 words. But there were certainly lots of stories like that didn't resonate. It does seem to have something of a Darwinian feel to it. Like there's lots and lots and lots of other articles that say Hillary is evil that didn't take off, and for whatever reason these resonated. These 5 examples aren't the best, but some of these are kind of funny in a way that partisans might enjoy laughing at them and being like, ha ha ha, look, I don't really believe this, but look how funny it is, right? So one of the most widely shared pro-Clinton fake news stories said Ireland is taking political asylum refugees from the United States because of Trump, right? And so how many people were sharing that because they actually believed it, how many were sharing it as a kind of expression of anti-Trump feelings or identity, right, is less clear.
Another one from online. So if raw fact-checking doesn't convince people and might even reinforce false beliefs, are there any strategies we have evidence for that do work?
Well, there is evidence that fact-checking works, right? So I don't want to be totally pessimistic here and say that this problem isn't solvable under any conditions. There's a lot of experimental work now looking at the influence of information from nonpartisan fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact and PolitiCheck and other organizations. When it comes outside of that framework, when it comes to just kind of watchdog journalism and trying to correct misperceptions in more widely read formats, there are all sorts of best practices that people can engage in. So one of the most widely studied ones that I would just point out as one example is that people are really bad at processing negations of claims. Okay, so Brendan's written on this. People over time tend to remember information. If you tell someone that something is false, they tend to remember the information over time, but they often forget that it's false, right? So this is an illusion. It's called the illusion of truth effect, right? So you might correct something. It might might change their factual beliefs at the point of the correction, but then over time, people are bad at processing cognitively that things are not true. Right, and so they might come to actually hold that belief more over time. So avoiding negations and framing things in the affirmative, right? So the classic example of this from recent years is Obama is a Christian versus Obama is not a Muslim. People just become, especially when they're motivated, right? Like they might be with that one. People are oftentimes susceptible to losing sight of the negation over time.
And unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming today.